Welcome everyone. Today's topic is about ecology, the study of living organisms, how they affect each other, and how they are affected by their surroundings and affect their surroundings. So it's both ways. Here in this topic, we study everything about living organisms and their surroundings. So let's move. Terms are many in this topic, so we want to make sure we understand most of these terms so that we can use them correctly. First of all, the word habitat is the place where an organism lives. So this lovely toucan, this bird, is called a toucan. And where would you think it lives? In rainforests. Yes. An environment is the surroundings of an organism. So you may call the rainforest also is the environment of that toucan. So it's the habitat and the environment where it lives. The adaptations are features that help an organism to survive in its environment. So what features do you think does this toucan have that helps it to survive in its environment? You might notice its large beak. Why would it need such a large beak? Maybe to break hard nuts or seed shells, even eggs. It eats eggs of other organisms to break the hard shells of such eggs. So this is an adaptation. Adaptation is a body part, a body covering, or a behavior that helps an animal to survive in its environment. So it's not just how the shape of the body looks. It could be a part of the body, all of the body, a behavior that helps this organism to survive. So the behavior is the action of an animal. So maybe if an animal hibernates in winter, this is a behavior, something that it does. It's not something that it has. So this is a way of adaptation. Camouflage is the color or a shape in an animal's body covering that helps it to blend into its environment. So you might have seen lovely videos of octopuses. They are very good at camouflage. Environment again, let's remember everything that surrounds and affects a living thing. Let's go into a little bit more detail. The environment includes non-living things such as water, the air, the temperature even, as well as other living things. So when we study the environment, we study the living things and other non-living things around them. Mimicry is an adaptation, which an otherwise harmless animal looks like a harmful animal in order to protect itself. This we see in many organisms, such as snakes, for example, where you can see them having similar colors, but they not all of them are poisonous. Some of them have similar markings or similar colors to those who are poisonous. So it just makes every organism fly away or hide away when they see them. So this is mimicry. So here is an example of mimicry. A butterfly that, spreading its wings, looks as if there's an owl face between the branches of a tree. That will work as a charm to deter away any predators of that butterfly. Another example, can you notice here? Wow, it looks like a thorn, doesn't it? But it has legs. Wow, it's not a thorn. It is actually an insect that looks like a thorn, so it hides very well. This is actually like camouflage, actually. It's not mimicry. This is camouflage, but, well, we can see other better examples of mimicry in the next slide. A monarch is a poisonous butterfly, and the one on the right-hand side is not a monarch, although it has almost the same colors, but it's called the viceroy. And this is a non-poisonous butterfly, but it does look like the monarch on the left-hand side. So it fools its predators. They do not eat it because they fear that they may become poisoned. Camouflage also, another example here, a lovely example. This stick insect, if it hides between any tree branches and stays quite still, you will never notice. And the predator will never see it as well. So here in this photo, we have two animals. We have cheetah and we have zebras. So how are they adapted? The markings on the zebra's body helps it to hide in long grass, doesn't it? So this is an adaptation. The cheetah has a slight frame, long legs, helps it to run very fast. Actually, it's the fastest animal on earth. Now, we want to remember some words that will help us again with ecology. So, what would you call an animal that hunts and eats other animals, such as this cheetah? Yes, you know, it is a predator. And the animal or the organism that's yet it must be an animal, cannot be a plant. The animal that is being eaten by that predator will be given another name. It's not a predator, it's a prey. So, if I have an organism that feeds only on plants, such as these zebras, we can give them a certain name. We're going to call them herbivores. And an organism that feeds on other animals, okay, so if an animal feeds on other animals, it is called a carnivore, such as this cheetah. What if an animal feeds on both plants and animals, you might ask? Well, yes, an omnivore. This is the name that we give it. So here we're going to track the energy and how it flows from one organism to another in an ecosystem. Where would you think does the energy come from? It should come from a source. So what is the main source of energy for all living things? It is yes, obviously, yes, the sun. Without it, none of the living organisms on this planet would exist. So the energy is captured by certain organisms, which are, yes, there are the plants. Organisms that have the ability to photosynthesize, capture the light energy and change it into chemical energy, food that is stored inside the cells of the plants. And then other organisms feed on them. So an organism that can make its own food, it does not need to rely on other organisms for feeding. We have a special name for such organisms. We call them producers. So an organism that can make its own food. An organism that cannot make its own food and relies on other organisms for feeding is going to be given a different name. It's going to be called a consumer. So these are also some terms to be added to what we have learned. Don't worry, we still have more. Here we're going to divide organisms according to the way they feed. We have just mentioned producers, organisms that can make their own food. We're going to give them another name here. Autotrophic organisms are organisms that can make their own food. Auto means self, and trophic means feeding. So self-feeding, so they can make their own food for themselves, like plants, just as we have just mentioned. Heterotrophic organisms, on the other hand, cannot make their own food. So they rely on other organisms. They feed on other organisms. We're going to divide heterotrophic organisms into three branches. Parasitic organisms are the first ones. These feed on other organisms while they are still alive, such as this mosquito. Yay! We hate mosquitoes, don't we? They are pests because they cause harm to a living organism. Fleas are the same thing. Ticks are also the same. Lice, even worms. There are many parasites that cause harm to other organisms. Saprotrophic or saprophytic organisms, they are those that decay or feed on other organisms by producing enzymes extracellularly, meaning outside of their cells, and these enzymes reach the body of that organism. Usually it is a dead organism, so these are decaying organisms mostly that cause decay, such as fungus, such as this mold on that tomato plant, okay? And they feed by digesting the food outside of their body, then drawing or taking in the food that has been digested into their bodies. Holozoic organisms, holo means whole, zoikos, is that how we pronounce it? I don't know. This is Greek, guys. I have never learned Greek. So anyways, animals, it means of animals. So holozoic organisms refers to organisms that take the food inside of their body and digest it inside. So this is due to intracellular digestion or digestion inside the body. So, such as we do as humans, we take the food into our body and the digestion happens inside, unlike saprotrophic organisms. So, some of those we did learn about herbivores before, you remember? These feed on plants only. Carnivores, on the other hand, feed on other animals. So they trap or they hunt, or they capture organisms. It doesn't have to be. Yes, we know carnivores are usually big lions and tigers and so forth, but also, for example, this frog over here, it is a carnivore when it is feeding on insects. Also, a spider is a carnivore because it traps other living organisms and it feeds on them. An omnivore is an organism that feeds on both plant and animals. Here we have a chicken feeding on seeds, and sometimes they like to change and eat some worms instead. So they are omnivores. So let's put our words to the test. We have learned many terms. We want to make sure that we know when to use them. So let's start. Here we have green plants. They are able to make their food by photosynthesis. So they are autotrophic organisms. They are producers also. Yes, you can use these two words. This is also a green plant, but it has an adaptation. It can trap insects and digest them, so maybe you could call it a carnivorous plant. But it still makes its own food by photosynthesis. What a tricky organism. A duck feeds on maybe fish in the pond, and maybe it feeds also on plants inside that pond. So you could call it a herbivore. And so if it does feed on both plants and animals, maybe we don't call it a herbivore anymore, we call it an omnivore, correct. And if it's eaten by other organisms, such as maybe foxes, it will be called a prey. This animal will living in the desert, it might have certain adaptations to allow it to live in such hot climates. But do you think this deer, is it a herbivore or a carnivore? Yes, it's a herbivore. Okay. And it is a prey for other organisms as well. Yes, you're right. Remember this butterfly? Yes, it mimics the other butterfly that is poisonous, the monarch butterfly. And probably it is eaten by other organisms, so it is a prey. Over here, we have a cell that lives in a pond. It's very difficult to tell if it's an animal cell or a plant cell, but we can see that it is green, so probably it makes its own food by itself. It is an autotrophic organism. Yes, this is an euglena. We call it an euglena. Ooh, this polar bear, it has certain adaptations to be able to live in the very cold climate where it lives, and it is white in color, so it is adapted so that it can blend easily in its environment. What do we call that? Camouflage, yes. And if it eats seals and eggs, and maybe some plant material, so it is probably an omnivore. Oh, a whale shark. So what are whale sharks? They are sharks, so they feed on other organisms. Yes, but this is very a peculiar shark. It does not eat fish. Actually, it feeds on plankton, so it is a herbivore. This is a bacteria. It causes the disease called cholera, and if it causes a disease, then it is a parasite because it lives inside the intestine of humans, causing them the disease that we call cholera. This is a grasshopper and or a locust, feeds on green plants, so it is a herbivore. Now, we want to revise how energy flows and what do we mean when we say food chains and food webs. Remember, the energy comes from the one source for all living organisms on this planet. It is the sun. So the energy from the sun flows in one direction. The sun gives us the light energy, and the light energy is captured by the organisms that are able to photosynthesize. Other organisms feed on them, and so forth. So we have what we call a food chain. When we draw a food chain, we want to show the feeding relationships of organisms, and we place arrows between these organisms to show where the energy goes. Remember, the arrows show the energy flow. They do not show which animal eats what. All right, so the direction of the arrow is very important. It shows that, for example, here water plants called W here, they have made their own food, being eaten by this fish X over here. The energy now is inside of the fish body. So the energy was in plants, now it's inside the fish. And when the pelican eats that fish, now the energy is inside the pelican, and then maybe this crocodile is going to eat that pelican, and now the energy is inside the body of that crocodile. So the energy is shown, the energy flow is shown by these arrows. So, in real life, there is no one food chain on its own. There are actually many food chains interconnected with one another. And when we draw such many different food chains, we call this a food web. So, a food web is a group of interconnected food chains. Now, let's look closely at these food chains. Can you name two producers? Remember, producers are organisms that make their own food. So yes, oak leaves and grass. These are two producers. Well done. Can you name two primary consumers? What is a primary consumer? A primary consumer is the first consumer in a food chain. We know what a consumer is. It's an organism that feeds on other organisms. So the first organism that comes in a food chain, such as in oak leaves, organisms that feed directly on these oak leaves are snails, earthworms, and voles. So these are going to be called primary consumers. So a snail is a primary consumer, an earthworm, a vole, this looking like a rat, and a rabbit, when it feeds on grass, is also a primary consumer. So all these four actually are primary consumers. Now, what is a secondary consumer? Can you name two secondary consumers in this food web? So secondary comes after primary. Yes, you're right. An owl feeding on the vole is a secondary consumer. The weasel feeding on the same vole is a secondary consumer. The hedgehog, when it feeds on earthworms or snails, is a secondary consumer. And the fox, when it feeds on the rabbit, it is also a secondary consumer. A tertiary consumer. So this feeds on a secondary consumer. So it comes after a secondary consumer. So do we have a tertiary consumer here? Yes, a fox when it feeds on a weasel, or actually this is the only way. Oh yes, and when it feeds on a hedgehog as well. So when it feeds on a hedgehog and when it feeds on the weasel, the fox is a tertiary consumer. So can you write a food chain from this food web that contains 4 organisms? Yes, we have just mentioned a fox is a tertiary consumer. So let's track 4 different organisms in the same food chain. Oak leaves, a snail, a hedgehog, and then the fox. This is a food chain with 4 organisms. Oak leaves, earthworm, hedgehog, and fox. Another food chain. Yes, you noticed another one. Oak leaves, vole, weasel, and fox. Again, you're right. So these are actually 3 food chains, each containing 4 organisms. No way, we still have more terms to learn. Yes, please bear with me. A population is the number of organisms of the same species in one area. We use this word, but we only used it for humans. So the population of people in Egypt are maybe 100 million and more, because we're counting organisms of the same species, humans, Homo sapiens. A community is all the different populations that are present in one area. So if we're counting humans and maybe chicken and maybe cattle and maybe horses, and these are different populations in a certain area, so this is going to be called a community. An ecosystem is a system containing all non-living things and living things in the same area. So we call that an ecosystem. Now let's practice. We have a student who is looking at a fish aquarium, and he tried to use these scientific words to describe the content. So let's see. Fish A and fish B cannot interbreed to give fertile offspring. It's not possible. They are 2 different. Yes, because they belong to 2 different species. Well done. Beetles, they feed on plants only. They are described as, yes, we just said before, they are herbivores. Animals that feed on plants only are herbivores. Now, fish A can eat beetles only. They are described as, so they don't eat plants, they just eat water beetles. So they are carnivores. You're right. Fish B eat plants, and they do eat fish A as well. So they feed on plants and they feed on other fish. So scientists gave them a name. What do they call them? They call them omnivores. Yes, you're right. And then the plants can make their own food by photosynthesis. What do we call such organisms? They are autotrophs, autotrophic organisms. And yes, if we had the word producer in front of us, we would have chosen it and we would have been correct. Water beetles, fish A and fish B, cannot make their own food. So, if they cannot make their own food, what would we call them? Consumers? Oh yes, but we don't have the word in front of us, so we're going to choose heterotrophs. So consumers is correct and heterotrophs is correct, but we're going to use the words in front of us. Let's move on. A word is given to all fish of the same type, type A, in this aquarium. So A, they look the same, and it has been mentioned that they can interbreed to give fertile offspring. A and B are not the same species. So if I'm counting all organisms of the same species, we're counting the population. So the population is the individuals of the number of individuals of the same species in a certain place. So fish A, fish B, water beetles, and the plants in the aquarium. So here we're counting all living organisms, right? So this is the community. Yes. Now, water, sand, rocks, and all living things. So here we're taking into consideration the non-living things and the living things inside the aquarium. Now we are considering this as an ecosystem, right? The aquarium is the place where these fish live. So we're going to call it it is their habitat. And the final thing, studying living things, living organisms, and the place they live in is a certain science that we are studying here. We call it ecology. Yes, so good job. Now we know our terms. Here we're going to draw bar charts to represent organisms in a food chain. And these bars are going to be drawn horizontally, and we're going to stack them above one another, like this drawing over here. In each pyramid, we always start with the producers at the bottom. So the rectangle at the bottom refers to the number or the mass of producers in a certain food chain. As we go further with the food chain, the primary consumers come later after the producers. They feed on them, so they are the bar that is above them. Secondary consumers comes above those, and tertiary consumers come even higher over them. These are the trophic levels. Trophic means feeding, if you remember. So these are the feeding levels. Producers are in the first trophic level. Primary consumers are in the second trophic level. Secondary consumers are in the third trophic level, and the tertiary consumers are in the fourth trophic level. So we have to make sure, what are we talking about? Are we talking about consumers or trophic levels? Now, we can designate numbers to each of these bars. So if it's a pyramid of numbers, then we are counting the number of producers, primary consumers, and the width of each rectangle is going to be in accordance to that figure. So if there are many producers, it will be a very long rectangle. If there are less primary consumers in number, if compared with producers, then the rectangle should be a bit smaller, all right, or has a different, lesser width, all right. Pyramids of biomass is when we find the mass of organisms, and it's not only finding the mass, actually. We try to remove all water from the body of the organism and take the mass of only the cells of the organisms without the mass of water interfering with that figure. So we call that biomass. Pyramids of biomass, we're going to have a look at them in a short while. A pyramid of energy is a pyramid that will show how much energy is in each trophic level. So this is an even better and accurate way of seeing organisms. This is an example. Here we have the mass of organisms. Maybe this is the biomass of these organisms, so grasses. Maybe we took a sample of grass in a certain area, maybe 1 meter squared, and we took this grass, placed it in an oven to evaporate off all the water, and then we found the mass of that area, and then we multiplied it by the total of the area of maybe a field or whatever. So this is how we find the biomass. Grasshoppers also, we'll take samples of grasshoppers, place them in an oven. Yes, oh, such a destructive method. We're going to kill these organisms, aren't we? Yes, that's why we don't prefer that, but it is a way of studying living organisms. Mice have less biomass, although they are bigger in size, but maybe because their numbers in an ecosystem is much less in comparison with grasshoppers, so the total mass of mice is going to be much less than grasshoppers. and snakes as well, because their numbers are even less than the prey that they feed on, so their biomass will be even less. This is how a normal pyramid looks like, but sometimes we get inverted pyramids. An inverted pyramid such as this, we have a rose bush. We're studying a rose bush, lovely roses. And the number is just one bush. But on this bush lives many green flies, this small green insect, being fed on upon by this ladybird, the red with black spots, the very famous insect. We love it. It feeds on green flies. All right. So there are many green flies in that rose bush, and there are some ladybirds feeding on them. And then maybe there are some parasites that are feeding on each ladybird. So here we can see that maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 parasites on the body of each of the ladybirds. So here we have an inverted pyramid of number. Okay. So here we have a pyramid of biomass. We have plants, seaweeds that live in the sea, and this is their mass. Remember, this is biomass, meaning that it is their mass after removing all water from their bodies using an oven, and this is the mass, 3,000 grams per meter squared. Periwinkles are organisms that feed on these seaweeds, and this is their mass, and dog whelks feed on these periwinkles. So you can see that we have a normal pyramid here, but sometimes the mass of organisms, the biomass of these organisms also is inaccurate or gives us an inaccurate pyramid. It might be because of the shells. They weigh a bit more than the animal that lives inside it. So that is why scientists prefer this energy pyramid. Scientists prefer energy pyramids because energy in any food chain decreases when we go to the next food level or trophic level. So water weeds, these plants, they have certain amount of energy inside of them. Tadpoles will eat some of these water weeds and the energy is transferred to their bodies. But because they are swimming, they are moving, they are respiring, not all the energy is going to be transferred to the next consumer, these small fish. So some energy is lost between each food chain. So this will cause that every energy pyramid of energy will always have the normal pyramid shape. The base has the largest size, and as we go up, it will be smaller and smaller. Here we're going to study population growth curves, and we're going to take an example of bacteria. It could be other examples. Sometimes I like to use the example of rabbits being introduced into a new area, maybe a new island, and when they start adapting to the place and finding their food, it will take them a while until they are adapted to this new place. They find a place to hide, they find their food. So their numbers won't rise a lot in the first period. So we call this the lag phase, where the numbers of the population of this organism is not increasing much. That's why we call it lag. So a person who is lagging, he's behind, okay? Now, next comes the exponential phase, or sometimes we call it the log phase. Organisms now are well adapted. They start to reproduce and they increase in numbers very quickly in an exponential way. So we can see this rise in the numbers, very quick rise. Then comes a stationary phase. Here, organisms have been increasing in numbers too fast and they are now crowding one another. They are competing for the food, they are competing for the space, and maybe some diseases are easily transmitted between them. So this causes the number of deaths and the number of births to be equal, and we have a stationary phase. This stationary phase might be followed by a decline or death phase. In an example of bacteria, maybe they produced a lot of wastes, and these wastes are killing the bacteria. So that's why they are dying. You can see that the shape of our graph looks like an S. So we call it an S-shaped curve, or we call it a sigmoid curve. So, are humans different? Let's look. Well, the numbers of humans, if we track them from maybe 2000 years ago, their numbers were not much, and they stayed at a very almost constant, or they have been increasing, but very, very slowly. So what would you call this period until maybe 1700? We will call this phase the lag phase. After 1750, the numbers have risen, and they are still rising very quickly. So we'll call this period the exponential phase or the log phase. What will happen next? What do you think if we keep tracking human population on Earth? Yes, the resources might be, we might be trying to find enough resources. There might be a stationary phase. Who knows? Now we want to study the factors affecting the size of a population. So maybe here we have some birds in a certain area, and if the number of births are more than the number of deaths, then the population is going to rise. What will cause that the number of births are faster or increasing than the number of deaths? Maybe because they can find their own food, so the availability of food will increase the size of any population. When more food is available, organisms will thrive and increase in numbers. But what would do the opposite? What causes deaths to increase above the number of births? Maybe presence of predators. Yes, this eagle here trying to feed on these small birds. So the presence of predators will cause numbers of any population to decrease. Also, the spread of diseases is a way to might reduce the number or the size of any population. So these are the main three factors that affect the size of population, but there are many other examples as well. So population pyramids. Here we have a pyramid that is drawn to show the number of people in a certain country. It is divided between males and females, and in each rectangle we have a certain age group. So the one at the base, the very bottom, is people who are between 0 and 4 years of age. The one above it is between 5 and 9 years of age, and so forth. So in Angola, we find that the pyramid looks like a very wide base, and then as we go up, the numbers decrease. This means that people in that country, as they grow older, the chances of them surviving decreases. So some of them die early before reaching years 5, being 5 years of age. In here we can see that people do not live above 84 years of age. You can see that 85 and 89 is 0%. And this is Angola in 2019. Here we're going to look at the United Kingdom 2019, and we can see that the base is much smaller in width. 3% only of the population is between 0 and 4 years of age. So this means that the families have less number of children in each family. We can see that the numbers do not vary much between 0 and 4, 5 and 9, 10 and 14. The numbers are almost the same, so which means that the survival of people in such a country is much better. Also, it shows that people can live up to 99 years of age in the United Kingdom. So this is an example of population pyramids in these two countries. Here we can see three different population curves, and in Kenya we have a very wide base, just like the one that we saw in Angola, and this is a population that is growing in size. We can see rapid growth. So the numbers of people in this population will continue to increase very quickly. In the United States, on the other hand, the numbers are almost the same between children and adults. So this is growing population, but it's growing very slowly. Here in Italy, we have a very different case. The numbers in the base are much less than the numbers at the top. So this means that people are not having children as often, and maybe the number of births are not enough, or they're not covering the death rate. So this is going, as a population, the numbers in such a population will decrease over time. A population pyramids of Egypt. Let's talk about Egypt. So in 1955, I have a population pyramid on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side is 2020. Can we see any differences? Well, in general, they look almost the same, but we can see some differences. Let's track those differences. At the base in Egypt, 1955, the base is much wider. Almost 9% of the population is between 0 and 4 years of age. But as we go to the next bar, between 5 and 9 years, we have 2% less. Children were not surviving until they are 5, or some of them did not survive to live to 5 years or 9 years of age. Maybe because the medical advances, maybe because the nutrition, maybe many reasons. But this has improved. We can see that in Egypt 2020, although the number of children are less, we can see that the numbers of between 0 and 4 are 6%. And it's almost the same between 5 and 9. So the number of deaths in children has decreased. Very good improvement. And if we can look at the age in Egypt, people were able to live up to 84 years of age, but now we have a group of people who live above that live up to 89 in 2020. So we can see a difference. And there is a great difference in the total number of population as well. We're a fast growing population. 23 million people in 1955. And after 70 years, around 70 years, now it's 100 million, 102 actually. So this is a fast growing population. Factors affecting human population. So what causes a human population to thrive and increase in numbers? Or maybe the opposite. Why doesn't it increase in numbers? Medical care advances. Well, if people have better access to health care, then they might not die from diseases, so they can survive longer, they can have children, and so the population will increase in numbers. That's why human population on Earth is thriving. Improved sanitation. Sanitation is making sure that the waste water coming out of our houses is dealt with correctly so that it does not pollute our rivers and lakes and oceans. And this is actually have improved in many places, such as in Egypt, so that diseases that get people infected is not as prevalent as before. Mass food production. Food nowadays is produced in factories, so we can produce a lot of it in very short time, so there is more food available for people. And maybe it's cheaper to produce as well, because in a factory you can produce a lot in a very short time. We use machinery in agriculture while growing plants and crops. We do not need to rely on people or a large number of people to cut and sort and package these crops. Now we use machinery that does the job in a very short time, so less effort is needed, so we can grow larger areas of land. And also, due to the use of fertilizers, we can grow areas that we couldn't have grown without fertilizers, such as deserts and so forth. Increased education causes people to make different choices. So, if I'm educated, I might postpone the age at which I decide to get married and have children. Maybe I want to make sure that I have a solid career first. Maybe I want to give my children enough time before having more children. So, increased education did cause that people make better choices at choosing to have less children in each family, so that each child gets enough nutrition, enough time, enough resources, so that it survives and becomes successful. Increased family planning methods. Well, as in education causes people to make better choices, people now choose to decide the time and the number of children they would like to have in their family. So when we increase planning methods, this will cause human population to not increase in number as much as earlier. The water cycle. This is easy. We took it since our primary years. Let's go through it very quickly. So, water in any body of water, such as a river, lake, or ocean, evaporates into water vapor, and as the water vapor rises to the higher areas of the sky where it's much colder, it condenses, and this is what we see as clouds. The clouds are now filled with small droplets of water, which look as clouds or look white to our eyes when the light hits it. Now, as the water droplets become bigger, it starts to fall as precipitation, as rain or as snow, and it falls to the ground where it could either run off into rivers or it could be absorbed by the soil, so it infiltrates the soil and it is absorbed by the roots of plants. It goes up through the xylem vessels in plants and it is lost throughout of the leaves by the transpiration, which helps to add more water vapor to the air where plants are present. That's why it's much more humid in areas where there are plants. So, the carbon cycle. We might have studied that also in previous years, so let's remind ourselves of what we have taken. Carbon dioxide is present in the air around us. A small percentage of air is carbon dioxide, less than 1% actually, but it is increasing yearly due to the action of burning fossil fuels. Every year, more fossil fuels are being burned to release energy. The only way to remove the carbon dioxide from the air is when plants photosynthesize. So this is the only way that removes carbon dioxide from the air. Carbon dioxide is used in plants for photosynthesis and it is changed into sugar, glucose, as you remember. The glucose is then changed into carbohydrates such as starch, such as cellulose, or proteins, or lipids, and these are now organic molecules inside the cells. Plants also respire. Animals that eat these plants, they will use the carbon molecules to respire, and the carbon dioxide is released back into the air. Animals will die and plants will die, and there are dead to decompose these dead organisms. There are decomposers in the soil. They will use the cells or the compounds in the cells of these animals and dead plants to respire as well. So animals will respire, uh, decomposers will respire, and plants. So these three ways help carbon dioxide to go back to the air. If animals and plants have been dead millions and millions years ago, and under high pressure and high temperatures, they have changed into fossil fuels, we call this fossilization. So these are fossils now, and people have extracted the fossils from deep places in the earth, and we are burning it to release energy in our factories, in our cars. So this releases again carbon dioxide into the air. Some of the carbon dioxide dissolves in the ocean, as you can see at the bottom right hand here. So this actually causes an increased acidity of the water in the oceans, which also harms some organisms because increased acidity will cause the shells that are made of carbonate compounds, calcium carbonate, for example, they start to dissolve. So the shells are weaker than before because of the increased acidity in the oceans. So we have to work on that problem as humans. We should try to either plant more plants to increase photosynthesis or reduce factory emissions, reduce the burning of fossil fuels, or maybe both. That would be excellent, wouldn't it? The nitrogen cycle. Now, this is only for Edexcel or the extended Cambridge learners. So those in year 9, you do not need to learn this part. Yes, it does look a bit too much, but let's take it one by one. Nitrogen gas in the air is two nitrogen atoms bonded together by three bonds, three covalent bonds. This is a very strong bond. It is not easily broken down. So plants do not have the ability to break down nitrogen and use the nitrogen atoms to make amino acids that are needed for making proteins for them to grow fast. So, what helps plants? Well, actually, there are some bacteria that are much better at using nitrogen from the atmosphere to make nitrate compounds, nitrates, or nitrites. So nitrogen compounds or ions in the soil are made by nitrogen fixing bacteria. Let's look at the nitrogen fixing bacteria on the left hand side. These plants, called legumes, have special nodules inside in the roots. These bumps or these big like pearl-looking structures. This is a place inside the root of the plant where the nitrogen-fixing bacteria have entered, and now the two organisms, the plants and the bacteria, are benefiting one another in a mutualistic relationship. Mutualism is when two organisms live together, both benefiting one another. So the bacteria inside the roots are using the nitrogen in the air and oxygen, combining them together to make nitrates or nitrites, which are useful for the plant growth. So plants absorb or take in these ions and use them for growth. On the other hand, plants provide sugars so that these bacteria can live, respire, and divide. So, this is one useful way by which bacteria help plants to enrich the soil with nitrates. This is only in legumes. Legumes are plants like chickpeas, like clover, برسيم, clover يعني برسيم. Farmers have noticed when they plant such plants And after they remove these plants from the soil, the new crop that is grown after it has grow much faster than usual. So they notice that these plants enhance the fertility of the soil. So they do love growing such things. And clover is also useful for feeding the animals in their farm. So it's both way of benefit. Now, other ways of providing soil with nitrates, well, lightning, because of that great volt of energy, nitrogen and oxygen in the air come together to make nitrates in the air, and they are soluble with rainfall, so they fall into the soil. The Haber process, for those who study chemistry, is a way by which in factories we are able to use nitrogen and to make nitrates, so that we have nitrogen fertilizers or inorganic nitrogen fertilizers. Finally, plants, when they are eaten by animals, they have nitrogen compounds in their body, so they make proteins with it. They excrete or they die, and also plants die, so we have organic remains in the soil. These organic remains are they decay by the action of decomposing bacteria and fungi, and they change into ammonia in the soil. And then another group of bacteria we call nitrifying bacteria will help to change ammonia into nitrates. So we have here three useful bacteria. We need to learn their names. Nitrogen fixing bacteria, present only in leguminous plants, decomposing bacteria, and nitrifying bacteria that work together so that nitrates are formed in the soil. One last thing, there is one group of bacteria that are not useful. They actually do the opposite of what we have just spoken about. These are called denitrifying bacteria, and denitrifying bacteria live in places where there is very little oxygen. So if there is a lot of water in the soil, the soil is waterlogged, we say. If the soil has not been ploughed and there are no air spaces between the soil particles, the denitrifying bacteria increase in numbers and they use the nitrates in the soil. They break down these nitrates because they need the oxygen in that molecule. So to reduce these denitrifying bacteria, the farmers make sure that the water is well managed so that it does not stay in the soil without having a way to leave the soil if it's too much. So there has to be a good filtration system maybe, or a good way so that the water moves in the soil, doesn't stay in one place. And ploughing their land after each crop, it also helps to reduce denitrifying bacteria. This concludes our chapter about ecology. All the best of luck to all of you. I know we're almost around the time of examinations. I wish you all the best of luck. Do your best. You can do it. Goodbye.